William Wallace emerged from the complex feudal landscape of late 13th century Scotland, born around 1270 into a world where personal loyalty, territorial disputes, and royal succession would ultimately shape the course of his extraordinary life. His father, Alan Wallace, held modest lands in Renfrewshire as a minor landholder, positioning the family within the intricate web of Scottish nobility that characterised medieval society. The Wallace name itself derived from the Norman French Llewellys, meaning the Welshman or the foreigner, suggesting the family's origins lay with settlers who had arrived in Scotland during the 12th century Anglo-Norman expansion. As the younger son in a feudal system that favoured primogeniture, William faced the typical constraints of his birth order. His elder brother Malcolm stood to inherit the family's modest estates, leaving William to seek his fortune through service, the church, or military prowess. This circumstance, common among the minor nobility, often produced men who possessed both the education of their class and the hunger for advancement that came with limited inheritance prospects. The Wallace family's holdings, while not extensive, provided sufficient resources to ensure William received an education befitting his station, likely including basic literacy in Latin and French, fundamental military training, and an understanding of feudal law and custom. The social hierarchy of 13th century Scotland operated through a complex system of personal bonds and territorial obligations that extended from the king down through the great magnates to minor landholders like Alan Wallace. The Scottish feudal system, while sharing similarities with its English and continental counterparts, retained distinctive characteristics rooted in older Celtic traditions. Land tenure often involved multiple overlapping claims, with some territories held directly from the crown while others remained subject to traditional clan loyalties or ancient ecclesiastical grants. This complexity would later prove crucial in understanding the political divisions that emerged during Scotland's succession crisis. The Wallace family's most significant feudal connection lay with the Stuart lineage, one of Scotland's most powerful noble houses. Alan Wallace served as a vassal to James Stuart, the fifth High Steward of Scotland, a relationship that bound the Wallaces into the broader political network surrounding the Scottish crown. This connection provided both opportunities and obligations, as feudal service required military support when called upon, participation in the Stuarts' judicial proceedings, and loyalty in political matters. For young William, growing up within this framework meant understanding that personal advancement depended not merely on individual merit, but on maintaining and leveraging these crucial relationships. The Stuart connection proved particularly significant given that family's prominent role in Scottish politics. James Stuart served as one of the 6 guardians of Scotland, following Alexander III's death, placing him at the centre of the kingdom's governance during its most turbulent period. The Stuarts' extensive lands across southwestern Scotland, including territories in Renfrewshire, where the Wallaces held their modest estates, created a regional power base that would later influence William's early military activities. The family's Norman origins, combined with their integration into Scottish society over several generations, exemplified the cosmopolitan nature of Scotland's medieval nobility. William's formative years unfolded during the final decade of Alexander III's reign, a period remembered as Scotland's last era of sustained peace and prosperity before the catastrophic succession crisis that followed. Alexander III had successfully consolidated royal authority, maintained relatively peaceful relations with England, and overseen a period of economic growth that strengthened Scotland's position among European kingdoms. The king's court attracted scholars, merchants, and diplomats from across Europe, creating an atmosphere of cultural sophistication that influenced even minor noble families like the Wallaces. The stability of Alexander's reign allowed feudal families to focus on consolidating their holdings and advancing their positions through service rather than survival. For the Wallace family, this meant opportunities to strengthen their ties with the Stuarts and potentially expand their modest influence within Renfrewshire's local governance. William's education during this period likely emphasised the skills necessary for feudal service: horsemanship, weapons training, basic military tactics, and the diplomatic skills required for negotiating the complex relationships between overlapping feudal obligations. This peaceful world shattered abruptly on March 19, 1286, when Alexander III died after falling from his horse during a storm while travelling to meet his young French wife, Yolande de Dreux. The king's death at age 44 left Scotland without a direct adult heir, as his only surviving descendant was his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, known to history as the Maid of Norway. The succession passed to this child, daughter of Alexander's deceased daughter, Margaret, and King Eric II of Norway, creating an unprecedented situation in Scottish royal history. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fragility of medieval royal succession. Scotland's magnates, recognising the dangers inherent in a minority reign, quickly established a regency council of 6 guardians to govern in young Margaret's name. This council included both secular and ecclesiastical leaders: Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow, William Fraser, Bishop of St Andrews, Duncan, Earl of Fife, Alexander Comyn, Earl of Buchan, John Comyn of Badenoch, and James Stewart, the Wallace family's feudal superior. The composition of this council reflected Scotland's complex political geography, balancing regional interests while attempting to maintain royal authority during the vulnerable minority period. For families like the Wallaces, Alexander's death introduced profound uncertainty about their future prospects. Feudal relationships that had seemed secure under an established adult king now depended on the survival and eventual majority of a foreign-born child queen. The Regency Council's authority, while legally established, lacked the personal bonds and proven leadership that had characterised Alexander's rule. Moreover, the presence of James Stewart among the Guardians placed the Wallace family in a potentially advantageous position, as their feudal superior now wielded significant influence in the kingdom's governance. The 4 years following Alexander's death witnessed increasing political instability as various factions manoeuvred for advantage in anticipation of Margaret's eventual arrival in Scotland. The Comyn family, through their immense extensive lands and kinship networks, emerged as perhaps the most powerful single faction, while the Bruce family began asserting their own claims to royal succession based on their descent from David I. The Stewart family, including their vassals like the Wallaces, found themselves navigating between these competing power centres while attempting to maintain their own regional authority. Young William Wallace, approaching his late teens during this period, witnessed firsthand how quickly political circumstances could transform the feudal landscape. The stability and predictability that had characterised his childhood gave way to an environment where personal loyalties faced constant testing and where military preparedness became increasingly essential for survival. The education he had received in feudal customs and obligations now required practical application, as his family's Stuart connections drew them into the broader political struggles consuming Scotland. The crisis deepened dramatically in September 1290, when news reached Scotland that the 7-year-old Margaret had died in Orkney while travelling from Norway to claim her throne. Her death extinguished the direct royal line and plunged Scotland into a succession dispute that would ultimately invite foreign intervention and fundamentally alter the kingdom's relationship with England. The various claimants to the throne, most notably John Balliol and Robert Bruce the Elder, possessed legitimate but competing genealogical arguments that Scottish law and custom could not easily resolve. The succession crisis following Margaret's death created the political vacuum that Edward I of England would exploit to assert his overlordship over Scotland. The Great Cause, as contemporaries termed the succession dispute, began in 1291 when Scotland's magnates, unable to resolve the competing claims through their own deliberations, agreed to accept Edward I as arbitrator. This decision, which seemed pragmatic given Edward's reputation as a skilled legal mind and his position as Europe's most powerful monarch, ultimately compromised Scottish independence in ways that the kingdom's leaders failed to fully anticipate. Edward's arbitration process, conducted with elaborate legal ceremony at Berwick-upon-Tweed, required all claimants to acknowledge him as Scotland's overlord before he would consider their cases. This acknowledgement, extracted under the pressure of Edward's military presence and diplomatic manoeuvring, established the legal foundation for English claims to Scottish feudal superiority that would persist for generations. The proceedings themselves, while conducted with apparent legal rigour, occurred within a framework that prioritised Edward's political interests over Scottish autonomy. The complexity of the genealogical arguments presented during the Great Cause reflected the intricate nature of medieval royal succession. John Balliol's claim rested on his descent from Margaret, eldest daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, brother of Kings Malcolm IV and William the Lion. Robert Bruce the Elder based his case on being the son of Isabella, second daughter of the same Earl David, arguing that his closer degree of relationship to the common ancestor gave him superior rights. Additional claimants, including John Hastings and John Comyn, presented their own arguments based on various interpretations of inheritance law and royal precedent. For families like the Wallaces, observing these proceedings from their position within the Stuart affinity, the Great Cause represented both opportunity and danger. A successful resolution might restore stability and create new avenues for advancement under whichever candidate emerged victorious. However, the involvement of Edward IV as arbitrator introduced an external element that threatened to subordinate all Scottish noble families to English overlordship, fundamentally altering the feudal relationships that had governed their lives. The political education William Wallace received during these formative years proved crucial to his later understanding of resistance strategy and diplomatic necessity. He witnessed how legal procedures could be manipulated to serve political ends, how external arbitration might compromise national sovereignty, and how the complex loyalties of feudal society could either strengthen or fragment resistance to foreign domination. The Stuart family's position during these proceedings, supporting the eventual winner John Balliol while maintaining their regional authority, demonstrated the delicate balance required to survive in an environment where political miscalculation could result in forfeiture and exile. Edward VI's eventual decision in favour of John Balliol in November 1292 temporarily resolved the succession crisis, while establishing the framework for future conflict. Balliol's coronation at Scone on November 30th, 1292, restored Scotland's monarchy, but under conditions that severely constrained royal authority. The new king's acknowledgement of Edward as his feudal superior meant that Scottish royal decisions could be appealed to English courts. Scottish military resources could be demanded for English campaigns, and Scottish foreign policy would be subject to English approval. These constraints became increasingly apparent during the early years of Balliol's reign, as Edward systematically undermined Scottish royal authority through legal and diplomatic pressure. Appeals from Scottish court decisions flooded English judicial proceedings, forcing Balliol to appear personally before Edward to defend his kingdom's legal decisions. When Edward demanded Scottish military service for his campaigns in France, the humiliation of Scotland's subordinate status became impossible to ignore, even for those nobles who had initially supported the English arbitration. The transformation of William Wallace from minor noble to national resistance leader emerged from a convergence of personal grievance, political opportunity, and military necessity that characterised Scotland's darkest hour under English occupation. By 1297, John Balliol's deposition 3 years earlier had left Scotland without effective royal leadership, while Edward VI's administrative apparatus systematically dismantled the kingdom's traditional governance structures. The English king's appointment of John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, as overlord of Scotland, supported by a network of sheriffs and justiciars drawn primarily from English nobles, created an occupation government that prioritised resource extraction over local stability. The legendary accounts of Wallace's motivations for rebellion, immortalised in later chronicles and popular tradition, centre on deeply personal grievances that supposedly drove him to take up arms against English rule. The most persistent of these narratives involves the murder of Wallace's father and brother by English officials, creating a blood debt that demanded vengeance according to medieval concepts of honour and family obligation. However, contemporary records provide no concrete evidence for such specific family murders, and the documented survival of Malcolm Wallace, William's elder brother, into the early 14th century contradicts the most dramatic versions of these tales. More credible accounts suggest that Wallace's rebellion stemmed from the accumulating pressures of English administrative control rather than a single catalytic event. The English sheriffs appointed to Scottish burghs possessed extensive judicial and financial powers that frequently brought them into conflict with local landholders over taxation, legal jurisdiction, and feudal obligations. These officials, unfamiliar with Scottish legal traditions and accountable primarily to English superiors, often employed harsh methods to enforce compliance with Edward's demands for tribute and military service. The specific circumstances that transformed Wallace from aggrieved landholder to active rebel likely involved a combination of personal legal disputes and broader political calculations. English administrative records from this period document numerous conflicts between Scottish landholders and English officials over property rights, feudal services, and judicial procedures. Wallace's position as a younger son with limited inheritance prospects may have made him particularly vulnerable to English legal challenges, while his Stuart connections provided both the military knowledge and political networks necessary for organising resistance. The rebellion that would establish Wallace's reputation began in earnest during May 1297, with his attack on the English-controlled burgh of Lanark. The strategic importance of this action extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, as Lanark served as a crucial administrative centre for English control over southwestern Scotland. The burgh's location at the crossing of several major routes between Glasgow, Edinburgh, and the English border made it an essential link in the communication and supply networks that sustained Edward's occupation government. Sheriff William Heselrigg, Wallace's primary target in the Lanark attack, embodied the harsh realities of English administrative control that had alienated much of Scotland's population. Appointed directly by Edward I, Heselrigg possessed broad judicial powers that he exercised with little regard for Scottish legal traditions or local sensibilities. Contemporary accounts describe him as particularly zealous in extracting taxes and enforcing English legal procedures, making him a focal point for Scottish resentment against the occupation government. The attack itself demonstrated Wallace's understanding of both military tactics and political symbolism. Rather than attempting a conventional siege of Lanark's fortifications, Wallace's forces struck during the early morning hours when the English garrison was dispersed and unprepared for coordinated resistance. The assault targeted specific English officials and their Scottish collaborators, while avoiding unnecessary destruction of the burgh's commercial infrastructure, suggesting careful planning designed to maximise political impact while maintaining local support. Heselrigg's death during the attack carried profound symbolic significance that resonated throughout Scotland's resistance networks. The sheriff's execution, reportedly carried out personally by Wallace, demonstrated that English officials were not immune to Scottish retribution despite their apparent military and legal advantages. This message proved particularly important for encouraging other potential rebels who had previously hesitated to challenge English authority due to fear of overwhelming retaliation. The broader context of Scottish resistance during spring 1297 reveals that Wallace's actions at Lanark formed part of a coordinated uprising that extended across multiple regions of the kingdom. In the northeast, Andrew Moray had begun organising resistance around his family's traditional strongholds in Moray and the surrounding highlands. Simultaneously, other Scottish nobles, including Robert Wishart, Bishop of Glasgow, and James Stewart, were coordinating efforts to challenge English control through both military action and diplomatic manoeuvring. This coordinated timing suggests that Wallace's rebellion while sparked by local grievances, connected to broader strategic planning among Scotland's resistance leadership. The Stuart family's prominent role in these preparations likely provided Wallace with advanced knowledge of the uprising's timing and objectives, allowing him to coordinate his actions at Lanark with complementary operations elsewhere in the kingdom. The success of these simultaneous attacks demonstrated that Scottish resistance possessed more organisation and strategic coherence than English officials had recognised. Wallace's early military campaigns following the Lanark attack revealed his exceptional ability to adapt guerrilla tactics to Scotland's geographical and political circumstances. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions against superior English forces, Wallace's bands moved rapidly through the forests and hills of southern Scotland, striking isolated garrisons and supply convoys before withdrawing to terrain that favoured defenders over pursuers. These tactics, while not entirely novel in medieval warfare, required intimate knowledge of local geography and the ability to maintain discipline among forces that lacked the formal military structure of conventional armies. The composition of Wallace's early following reflected his success in uniting disparate elements of Scottish society around the common cause of resisting English occupation. His forces included dispossessed nobles like himself, younger sons seeking advancement through military service, burgesses whose commercial interests suffered under English taxation, and common farmers whose traditional obligations had been disrupted by the occupation government. This social diversity required exceptional leadership skills to maintain cohesion and prevent the factional disputes that had historically weakened Scottish military efforts. Wallace's partnership with Andrew Moray emerged as perhaps the most crucial development in the early phase of Scottish resistance. Moray, heir to extensive lands in northeastern Scotland, brought complementary strengths that perfectly matched Wallace's own capabilities. Where Wallace excelled in inspiring popular support and organising guerrilla operations, Moray possessed extensive military training, established networks among the northern nobility, and experience in conventional siege warfare gained during his imprisonment and subsequent escape from English custody. The geographical division of their operations created a strategic pincer movement that stretched English resources across multiple fronts, while preventing effective coordination of counterinsurgency efforts. Wallace's activities in the south drew English forces away from Moray's operations in the north, while Moray's success in capturing key fortifications like Inverness and Elgin demonstrated that Scottish resistance could achieve conventional military victories against English garrisons. Their complementary leadership styles proved equally important for maintaining the political coalition necessary for sustained resistance. Wallace's charismatic appeal to popular sentiment balanced Moray's more traditional approach to noble leadership, creating a partnership that could appeal simultaneously to Scotland's social elite and its broader population. This combination proved essential for overcoming the historical divisions between Highland and Lowland Scotland that had previously limited the scope of coordinated military action. The rapid expansion of Wallace and Moray's influence during summer 1297 demonstrated their exceptional political acumen in exploiting the leadership vacuum created by Edward's deposition of John Balliol. Scotland's traditional nobility, many of whom had been compromised by their previous submissions to English authority, found themselves unable to provide credible leadership for national resistance. The absence of effective royal leadership created opportunities for men like Wallace and Moray, who possessed both the military skills and political flexibility necessary for organising opposition to English rule. Wallace's rise from a minor noble to co-guardian of Scotland alongside Moray represented one of the most dramatic social ascensions in medieval Scottish history. This elevation required not only military success, but also the political sophistication necessary for navigating Scotland's complex web of noble relationships and regional loyalties. Wallace's ability to maintain the support of established nobles while appealing to broader popular sentiment demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skills that complemented his military capabilities. The appointment of Wallace and Moray as joint guardians following their military successes represented both recognition of their achievements and acknowledgement of the new political realities created by sustained resistance to English rule. Their guardianship, while lacking the traditional legitimacy of royal appointment, derived its authority from military effectiveness and popular support rather than hereditary right or feudal obligation. This innovation in Scottish governance reflected the extraordinary circumstances of foreign occupation and the need for leadership that could adapt to unconventional political and military challenges. The partnership between Wallace and Moray as co-guardians established a precedent for shared leadership that would influence Scottish governance throughout the independence wars. Their ability to coordinate strategy across Scotland's diverse regions while maintaining their individual areas of expertise created a model for effective resistance leadership that later Scottish commanders would attempt to emulate. The success of their collaboration demonstrated that Scotland's geographical and cultural diversity, often seen as obstacles to unified action, could become sources of strength when properly coordinated. Their joint guardianship also represented a conscious effort to balance regional interests and prevent the domination of Scottish resistance by any single faction or geographical area. Wallace's southwestern origins and popular appeal complemented Moray's northeastern base and noble connections, creating a leadership structure that could credibly claim to represent Scotland's entire population, rather than merely sectional interests. This inclusive approach proved crucial for maintaining the broad coalition necessary for sustained resistance against English occupation. The military and political foundations established during Wallace and Moray's early campaigns created the framework for the major confrontation that would define their partnership and establish their reputations in Scottish history. Their success in coordinating resistance across multiple regions, uniting diverse social groups, and challenging English control of key strategic positions demonstrated that Scotland possessed both the leadership and popular support necessary for effective opposition to Edward III's occupation government. The convergence of Wallace and Moray's forces near Stirling in early September 1297 represented the culmination of months of coordinated resistance that had systematically eroded English control across Scotland. Their decision to confront the English army at Stirling Bridge demonstrated both strategic brilliance and calculated risk-taking that would define Wallace's approach to warfare throughout his career. The location itself held immense strategic significance, as Stirling controlled the primary crossing point of the River Forth and served as the gateway between Scotland's highlands and lowlands. Control of this position would effectively sever English communication lines between their southern strongholds and the occupied territories in northern Scotland. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, commanded the English force dispatched to crush the Scottish rebellion with the confidence of a veteran military leader who had served Edward I in Wales and Gascony. His army, numbering approximately 8,000 to 10,000 men, included substantial contingents of heavy cavalry, professional infantry, and Welsh longbowmen whose effectiveness had been proven in previous campaigns. The force also incorporated Scottish nobles who had submitted to English authority, including John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, and several other magnates whose local knowledge was expected to provide crucial intelligence about Scottish tactics and terrain. Surrey's approach to the campaign reflected the conventional military wisdom of his era, which emphasised the superiority of disciplined professional forces over irregular resistance movements. His previous experiences in Edward's service had reinforced confidence in direct confrontation as the most effective method for crushing rebellion, particularly when supported by overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. The Earl's decision to advance directly towards Stirling demonstrated his belief that Scottish resistance would collapse when faced with the full might of English military power. The terrain surrounding Stirling Bridge created a natural amphitheatre that Wallace and Moray recognised could neutralise many of the English army's conventional advantages. The River Forth curved sharply around the base of Stirling Castle's rocky outcrop, creating a narrow bottleneck where the ancient wooden bridge provided the only practical crossing point for large military formations. The northern approach to the bridge led through marshy ground that would severely hamper cavalry operations, while the southern bank offered elevated positions from which Scottish forces could observe English movements without revealing their own dispositions. Wallace and Moray's tactical planning for the confrontation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both terrain analysis and enemy psychology. Rather than attempting to prevent the English crossing entirely, they positioned their forces to allow a significant portion of Surrey's army to cross before launching their attack. This approach required exceptional discipline from troops who would watch enemy forces deploy unmolested while waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The success of such tactics depended entirely on precise timing and the ability to maintain command control during the critical phases of battle. The Scottish force, numbering approximately 5,000 to 6,000 men, consisted primarily of infantry armed with long spears, axes and other weapons suited to close combat in difficult terrain. The army's composition reflected the popular nature of the resistance movement, drawing fighters from across Scotland's social spectrum rather than relying solely on traditional feudal levies. This diversity required innovative approaches to military organisation and command structure, as conventional medieval armies typically relied on established hierarchies based on noble rank and feudal obligation. Wallace and Moray's joint command structure represented a practical solution to the challenges of leading such a diverse force while maintaining the rapid decision-making capabilities essential for tactical success. Their complementary skills allowed for division of responsibilities during the battle's planning and execution phases, with Moray's conventional military training balancing Wallace's intuitive understanding of irregular warfare tactics. This partnership enabled them to coordinate complex maneuvers while maintaining the flexibility necessary for responding to unexpected developments during combat. The morning of September 11th, 1297, witnessed a series of preliminary manoeuvres that revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the opposing forces. Surrey's initial reconnaissance identified Scottish positions on the northern bank but failed to appreciate the tactical implications of the terrain constraints surrounding the bridge. English commanders, accustomed to open battlefield conditions that favoured their cavalry and longbow units, underestimated the challenges posed by the confined crossing point and the marshy ground beyond. Scottish preparations during the pre-battle period demonstrated meticulous attention to tactical detail that contradicted English assumptions about their opponent's military sophistication. Wallace and Moray had carefully studied the bridge's structural limitations, determining precisely how many men could cross simultaneously and calculating the time required for significant English forces to deploy on the northern bank. This analysis informed their decision about when to launch their attack for maximum tactical advantage. The English advance began with Surrey's characteristic confidence, as his forces approached the bridge in conventional formation, with cavalry leading the van, followed by infantry and support elements. The crossing itself proceeded initially without opposition, reinforcing English assumptions that Scottish resistance would prove ineffective against professional military forces. However, the narrow bridge created inevitable delays and congestion that gradually extended the English army across both sides of the river, creating exactly the tactical situation that Wallace and Moray had anticipated. The Scottish attack commenced with devastating precision when approximately half of Surrey's force had crossed to the northern bank, but before sufficient numbers had deployed to establish effective defensive positions. Wallace and Moray's forces struck simultaneously at the bridge itself and against the English troops attempting to form battle lines on the marshy ground beyond. The timing of this assault demonstrated exceptional command coordination, as both leaders had to judge the optimal moment for attack based on rapidly changing tactical conditions. The initial Scottish charge focused on seizing control of the bridge's northern approach, effectively trapping the English forces that had already crossed while preventing reinforcements from Surrey's main body on the southern bank. This manoeuvre required Scottish troops to advance across difficult terrain under potential English arrow fire, but the element of surprise and the confusion created by the unexpected attack minimised these risks. The success of this phase depended entirely on the Scottish infantry's ability to maintain formation discipline while executing complex movements under combat conditions. English forces on the northern bank found themselves caught between the advancing Scottish infantry and the river, with retreat possible only through the narrow bottleneck of the bridge itself. The marshy ground that had initially seemed merely inconvenient now became a deadly trap, as heavily armoured cavalry discovered their mounts could not manoeuvre effectively in the soft terrain. The tactical situation that Surrey had expected to favour his professional forces instead created conditions where Scottish infantry could engage English cavalry on nearly equal terms. The death of Hugh de Cressingham, Edward the Steers's treasurer in Scotland, during the battle's early phases eliminated one of the most competent English commanders while providing powerful symbolic victory for Scottish resistance. Cressingham's aggressive leadership had made him a particular target of Scottish hatred due to his role in implementing the harsh taxation policies that had helped fuel the rebellion. His death, reportedly at the hands of Scottish infantry who recognised his distinctive armour and heraldic symbols, demonstrated that English officials were not immune to the consequences of their oppressive policies. Surrey's attempts to coordinate relief efforts from the southern bank revealed the fundamental tactical problems created by the bridge's limitations. The Earl could observe the developing disaster affecting his advance forces, but lacked effective means for providing assistance without committing additional troops to the same constrained crossing point. His professional military experience, which had served him well in conventional campaigns, proved inadequate for addressing the unique challenges posed by the terrain and Scottish tactical innovations. The collapse of English resistance on the northern bank occurred with startling rapidity once Scottish forces established control of the bridge approach. English troops, finding themselves unable to retreat and increasingly outnumbered by Scottish reinforcements, began surrendering or attempting desperate escapes across the river. The psychological impact of this reversal proved as devastating as the tactical defeat, as professional soldiers who had expected easy victory instead faced the prospect of death or capture at the hands of forces they had dismissed as rabble. Wallace and Moray's management of victory demonstrated political sophistication that complemented their tactical brilliance. Rather than allowing their troops to engage in indiscriminate slaughter of defeated enemies, they maintained sufficient discipline to capture valuable prisoners while preventing the excesses that might have undermined their claims to legitimate authority. This restraint proved crucial for maintaining the moral authority necessary for effective leadership of Scottish resistance. The strategic consequences of Stirling Bridge extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, as the battle's outcome fundamentally altered the balance of power between English occupation forces and Scottish resistance. Surrey's defeat eliminated the largest English field army in Scotland, while demonstrating that professional English forces could be defeated by properly led Scottish troops. The psychological impact of this revelation spread rapidly throughout both kingdoms, encouraging Scottish resistance while undermining English confidence in their ability to maintain control through military force alone. Wallace's invasion of northern England during autumn 1297 represented the logical extension of his victory at Stirling Bridge, transforming defensive resistance into offensive operations designed to carry the war into English territory. This strategic shift required careful calculation of Scottish military capabilities against the risks of extended operations beyond familiar terrain. The decision to invade demonstrated Wallace's understanding that purely defensive strategies would ultimately favour the English, who possessed superior resources for sustained warfare. The Scottish army that crossed into Northumberland in October 1297 differed significantly from the force that had fought at Stirling Bridge, reflecting both the confidence generated by victory and the practical requirements of offensive operations. Wallace had expanded his forces through recruitment drives that attracted volunteers from across Scotland, while captured English equipment provided improved armament for troops who had previously relied on improvised weapons. The army's enhanced capabilities enabled more ambitious strategic objectives than had been possible during the initial phases of resistance. Wallace's approach to warfare in northern England demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and economic warfare principles that would later be recognised as early examples of total war concepts. Rather than attempting to capture and hold English fortifications, which would have required extended sieges beyond Scottish capabilities, Wallace's forces concentrated on systematic destruction of the region's economic infrastructure. This strategy aimed to impose costs on English support for Edward's Scottish policies, while demonstrating Scottish military reach to English populations who had previously considered themselves safe from retaliation. The siege techniques employed by Scottish forces during the invasion revealed Wallace's ability to adapt military methods to available resources and strategic objectives. Unable to deploy the sophisticated siege engines used by professional armies, Scottish forces relied on rapid assaults against weakly defended positions while bypassing stronger fortifications that would have required extended investment of time and resources. This approach maximised territorial coverage while minimising the risks associated with prolonged siege operations that might allow English relief forces to trap Scottish armies in disadvantageous positions. Scottish scorched earth policies during the invasion created widespread destruction across Northumberland and Cumberland that served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. The systematic burning of crops, destruction of mills, and slaughter of livestock eliminated resources that might support future English military operations, while demonstrating Scottish capability to project power deep into English territory. These tactics also generated refugee flows that strained English administrative resources and created political pressure for negotiated settlement of the conflict. The psychological impact of Scottish raids on English civilian populations proved as significant as their material effects, fundamentally altering English perceptions of their security and the conflict's likely duration. Northern English communities that had supported Edward's Scottish campaigns now experienced directly the costs of prolonged warfare, creating political pressure for policies that might restore peace and security. Wallace's success in carrying the war into English territory demonstrated that Scottish resistance possessed both the military capability and strategic vision necessary for sustained offensive operations. Following Moray's death from wounds sustained at Stirling Bridge, Wallace's elevation to sole guardian of Scotland marked a crucial transition in both his personal authority and the resistance movement's political structure. This appointment, formalised by Scotland's remaining nobles and ecclesiastical leaders, represented unprecedented recognition of military merit over traditional feudal hierarchy. Wallace's acceptance of sole guardianship required him to assume responsibilities for governance, diplomacy, and military strategy that extended far beyond his previous role as a regional resistance leader. Wallace's diplomatic initiatives as guardian demonstrated remarkable sophistication in medieval international relations, particularly his efforts to secure French support for Scottish independence. His embassy to Philip IV's court in 1298 sought to activate the traditional Franco-Scottish alliance, while presenting Scotland's case in terms that would appeal to French strategic interests. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals Wallace's understanding that Scottish independence required international recognition and support that could offset English military advantages. The Guardian's efforts to secure papal recognition for Scottish independence reflected similar strategic thinking about the importance of international legitimacy for resistance movements. Wallace's appeals to Pope Boniface VIII emphasised both the religious dimensions of Scottish resistance to English occupation and the legal arguments supporting Scottish independence based on historical precedent and canon law. These diplomatic initiatives demonstrated Wallace's recognition that military success alone would prove insufficient for achieving lasting independence without broader international support. Wallace's administrative reforms during his guardianship revealed his understanding that effective resistance required governmental structures capable of maintaining national unity and coordinating resources for sustained warfare. His efforts to restore Scottish royal authority through revival of traditional governmental institutions provided continuity with pre-occupation political structures while adapting to the practical requirements of wartime governance. These reforms included restoration of Scottish legal procedures, re-establishment of royal taxation systems, and coordination of local governance structures that had been disrupted by English occupation. The Guardian's success in maintaining national unity during this period required exceptional political skills for managing the complex relationships between Scotland's diverse regional and social groups. His ability to balance competing interests while maintaining focus on the common goal of independence demonstrated leadership capabilities that extended far beyond military command. Wallace's guardianship represented a unique experiment in Scottish governance that combined traditional royal authority with innovative approaches to popular leadership and national mobilisation. The euphoria surrounding Wallace's guardianship and the triumph at Stirling Bridge proved tragically short-lived, as Edward thus marshalled the full resources of the English crown for a devastating counter-offensive that would expose the fundamental limitations of Scottish resistance. The English king's return from his continental campaigns in March 1298 brought renewed focus and unprecedented military resources to the Scottish theatre, transforming what had been a colonial policing action into a full-scale war of conquest. Edward's personal involvement signalled his recognition that Scottish resistance under Wallace's leadership posed a genuine threat to English strategic interests that required immediate and decisive action. The English army that assembled at York during spring 1298 represented the largest military force Edward had ever deployed against Scotland, numbering approximately 25,000 men drawn from across his continental and insular domains. The force included substantial contingents of Welsh longbowmen, whose devastating effectiveness had been proven during Edward's conquest of Wales, Gascon crossbowmen recruited from his French territories, and heavy cavalry formations representing the elite of English feudal military service. Most significantly, Edward had learned from Surrey's defeat at Stirling Bridge, incorporating tactical innovations designed specifically to counter the Scottish infantry tactics that had proven so effective against conventional English formations. Wallace's preparations for the inevitable confrontation revealed both his strategic acumen and the resource constraints that would ultimately doom Scottish resistance to failure. His efforts to expand Scottish military capabilities through recruitment drives and equipment acquisition had achieved remarkable success, fielding an army of approximately 15,000 men by summer 1298. However, the Scottish force remained fundamentally limited by its reliance on infantry formations that, while effective in defensive positions or against smaller English forces, lacked the tactical flexibility necessary for confronting Edward's combined arms approach. The strategic situation facing Wallace as Guardian during early 1298 presented a series of increasingly difficult choices that reflected the broader challenges confronting medieval resistance movements. His success at Stirling Bridge had been achieved through tactical surprise and favourable terrain conditions that could not be replicated in a general engagement against Edward's main army. The English king's systematic approach to the campaign, involving coordinated advances from multiple directions supported by extensive supply trains and siege equipment, eliminated many of the geographical advantages that had previously favoured Scottish forces. Wallace's decision to adopt a defensive strategy based on avoiding pitched battle while harassing English supply lines demonstrated his realistic assessment of Scottish military limitations. This approach, similar to tactics he had employed successfully during his rise to prominence, aimed to impose unsustainable costs on English operations while preserving Scottish military strength for more favourable opportunities. However, the political pressures of guardianship and the expectations generated by previous victories made such cautious strategies increasingly difficult to maintain, without appearing to abandon Scottish territorial integrity. The manoeuvring that preceded the Battle of Falkirk revealed the fundamental asymmetry between English and Scottish strategic capabilities during this phase of the conflict. Edward's ability to coordinate multiple army columns while maintaining secure supply lines from England provided tactical flexibility that forced Wallace to react to English initiatives rather than implementing his own strategic vision. The English king's systematic destruction of Scottish crops and livestock during his advance created additional pressure for decisive action, as prolonged English occupation threatened to undermine the economic foundations necessary for sustained resistance. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, began with tactical dispositions that initially appeared to favour Scottish defensive capabilities, as Wallace had selected terrain that limited English cavalry effectiveness while providing his infantry with elevated positions overlooking the battlefield. The Scottish army deployed in 4 large schiltrons, circular formations of spearmen designed to present impenetrable barriers to cavalry charges while maintaining defensive cohesion under pressure. These formations, supported by smaller contingents of archers and light cavalry, represented the culmination of tactical innovations that had evolved through months of combat experience against English forces. Edward's approach to the battle demonstrated the tactical lessons he had absorbed from Surrey's defeat at Stirling Bridge, particularly the importance of combined arms coordination and careful reconnaissance before committing forces to action. The English deployment integrated longbow units with heavy cavalry and infantry formations in mutually supporting positions that could respond flexibly to Scottish tactical manoeuvres. Most crucially, Edward's battle plan prioritised the systematic destruction of Scottish formations through concentrated missile fire rather than relying solely on cavalry charges that had proven vulnerable to Scottish spear tactics. The opening phases of Falkirk witnessed the rapid collapse of Scottish tactical advantages, as English longbowmen demonstrated their devastating effectiveness against infantry formations that lacked adequate protection from missile fire. The Scottish schiltrons, while nearly impregnable to cavalry attack, presented concentrated targets that English archers could engage with minimal risk of retaliation. The sustained arrow storms that preceded English cavalry charges systematically weakened Scottish defensive positions while maintaining English tactical flexibility for exploiting emerging opportunities. The betrayal of Scottish cavalry forces during the battle's critical phases represented perhaps the most devastating blow to Wallace's tactical planning and long-term political authority. The Scottish nobles commanding the cavalry wings, including John Comyn of Badenoch and other magnates whose loyalty had always been questionable, withdrew their forces from the battlefield at the moment when their intervention might have disrupted English tactical coordination. This abandonment left Scottish infantry formations isolated and exposed to coordinated English attacks that their defensive tactics could not effectively counter. The systematic destruction of Scottish schiltrons under combined English missile and cavalry assault demonstrated the limitations of defensive infantry tactics against properly coordinated combined arms operations. As English arrows decimated the front ranks of Scottish spearmen, gaps appeared in formations that had previously been impenetrable to cavalry attack. English heavy cavalry, supported by infantry and continued archery, exploited these weaknesses with devastating effectiveness, transforming what had begun as a defensive stalemate into a comprehensive tactical disaster for Scottish forces. Wallace's personal conduct during the battle's final phases revealed both his courage as a military leader and his recognition of the strategic catastrophe that Scottish defeat represented. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting desperately to rally collapsing Scottish formations, while attempting to organise an effective retreat that might preserve some portion of his army for future operations. However, the completeness of English tactical victory and the betrayal of Scottish cavalry made organised withdrawal impossible, forcing Wallace to flee the battlefield with only a small bodyguard of loyal followers. The immediate aftermath of Falkirk witnessed the rapid collapse of Scottish resistance infrastructure that Wallace had spent months constructing during his guardianship. English forces systematically occupied Scottish strongholds that had been abandoned by their garrisons, while Scottish nobles who had previously supported the resistance movement began negotiating individual submissions to Edward's authority. The psychological impact of Wallace's defeat proved as devastating as its tactical consequences, undermining confidence in Scottish military capabilities and encouraging defections among previously committed supporters. Wallace's resignation from the guardianship following Falkirk represented both personal acknowledgement of military failure and realistic assessment of his diminished political authority within Scottish resistance circles. The appointment of John Comyn of Badenoch and Robert Bruce the Younger as joint guardians reflected Scotland's reversion to traditional noble leadership structures that Wallace's military success had temporarily displaced. However, this transition also eliminated the unified command structure that had been essential for coordinating effective resistance against English occupation forces. The 7-year period following Wallace's resignation from the guardianship witnessed his transformation from failed military leader to international diplomat seeking foreign support for Scottish independence. This phase of his career, while less dramatic than his military campaigns, demonstrated remarkable persistence and strategic vision in pursuing diplomatic solutions to problems that had proven beyond Scottish military capabilities. Wallace's recognition that Scottish independence required international support and recognition reflected sophisticated understanding of medieval diplomatic and legal frameworks that governed relations between European kingdoms. Wallace's diplomatic mission to France during 1299 represented the most significant attempt to activate the traditional Franco-Scottish alliance that had historically balanced English power in northwestern Europe. His embassy to Philip IV's court coincided with escalating tensions between France and England over Gascon territorial disputes, creating opportunities for Scottish diplomatic initiatives that might align French strategic interests with Scottish independence objectives. The detailed instructions Wallace received from Scottish political leaders revealed the complexity of medieval diplomatic procedures and the careful preparation required for successful international negotiations. The reception Wallace received at the French court demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Franco-Scottish diplomatic cooperation during this period. Philip IV's government expressed sympathy for Scottish independence aspirations and provided limited financial support for Wallace's mission. But French strategic priorities focused primarily on continental European concerns rather than British Isles conflicts. The French king's reluctance to commit substantial military resources to Scottish independence reflected realistic assessment of the logistical challenges and strategic risks involved in direct confrontation with English power. Wallace's subsequent diplomatic initiatives in Rome revealed his understanding that papal recognition of Scottish independence claims might provide legal foundations for international support that purely secular diplomatic efforts could not achieve. His appeals to Pope Boniface VIII emphasised both the religious dimensions of English occupation policies and the canonical legal arguments supporting Scottish independence based on historical precedent and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. These efforts reflected sophisticated knowledge of medieval legal theory and the crucial role of papal authority in legitimising political claims during this period. The papal response to Wallace's diplomatic initiatives provided moral support for Scottish independence claims while avoiding the direct political intervention that might have fundamentally altered the conflict's international dimensions. Boniface VIII's communications with Edward I regarding Scottish affairs expressed papal concern about English policies, while stopping short of the explicit condemnation that Wallace had sought. This diplomatic outcome, while disappointing for Scottish hopes, demonstrated the complex international considerations that limited external support for medieval independence movements. Wallace's possible diplomatic mission to Norway during this period, while less well documented than his French and Roman initiatives, reflected his comprehensive approach to securing international support for Scottish independence. The Norwegian connection stemmed from historical claims related to the Maid of Norway's brief reign and ongoing disputes over Scottish island territories that remained under Norwegian sovereignty. These diplomatic efforts, regardless of their ultimate success, demonstrated Wallace's recognition that Scottish independence required broader international recognition than could be achieved through purely military means. The gradual erosion of Wallace's international diplomatic position during the early 1300s reflected both changing European political circumstances and the practical limitations facing medieval diplomatic initiatives. The resolution of Franco-English tensions over Gascon territories eliminated French incentives for supporting Scottish independence, while papal attention shifted toward other European conflicts that posed more direct threats to ecclesiastical interests. Wallace's diplomatic isolation paralleled the broader decline of Scottish resistance capabilities as prolonged warfare exhausted the kingdom's resources and undermined popular support for continued conflict. Wallace's return to Scotland around 1304 occurred within a dramatically altered political landscape that offered few opportunities for renewed military leadership or diplomatic influence. The systematic English conquest of Scottish strongholds during his absence had eliminated most centres of organised resistance, while the submission of virtually all Scottish nobles to Edward's authority had destroyed the political networks that had previously supported independence efforts. Wallace's presence in Scotland during this period represented both personal commitment to Scottish independence and recognition that his diplomatic efforts had failed to secure the international support necessary for renewed resistance. The circumstances surrounding Wallace's capture near Glasgow in August 1305 revealed the extent to which Scottish resistance had been compromised by collaboration with English authorities. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had previously supported the independence cause, provided crucial intelligence that enabled English forces to locate and apprehend Wallace, despite his efforts to avoid detection. This betrayal represented the culmination of a systematic English campaign to isolate Wallace from potential supporters while offering incentives for Scottish cooperation in his capture. Edward the Scist's determination to make Wallace's capture and trial a public demonstration of English authority reflected both personal animosity toward the Scottish leader and calculated political strategy for deterring future resistance. The decision to transport Wallace to London for trial rather than executing him immediately in Scotland emphasised the ceremonial aspects of royal justice while providing maximum publicity for English claims to legitimate authority over Scottish affairs. The elaborate legal proceedings that followed demonstrated Edward's commitment to presenting his actions as lawful punishment of rebellion rather than mere political revenge. Wallace's trial in Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, represented the culmination of Edward I's efforts to legitimise English conquest of Scotland through legal procedures that portrayed Scottish resistance as treasonous rebellion against lawful authority. The charges brought against Wallace included treason against Edward as his feudal superior, murder of English officials, destruction of English property, and sacrilege against English churches. These accusations, while legally crafted to justify the death penalty under English law, fundamentally misrepresented the nature of Scottish independence claims and Wallace's role as a legitimate military leader rather than a common criminal. Wallace's response to the treason charges revealed both his personal courage and his sophisticated understanding of the legal and political issues underlying the Anglo-Scottish conflict. His reported declaration that he could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign directly challenged the legal foundations of English claims to Scottish overlordship. This defiant response, while legally irrelevant to the trial's predetermined outcome, provided a powerful statement of Scottish independence principles that would resonate throughout subsequent generations of Scottish political thought. The brutal execution that followed Wallace's conviction demonstrated Edward's determination to eliminate any possibility of Wallace becoming a martyr figure who might inspire future Scottish resistance. The sentence of hanging, drawing and quartering represented the most severe punishment available under English law, designed to inflict maximum suffering while providing a public spectacle that would deter potential rebels. The systematic torture involved in this execution method reflected both medieval concepts of justice and Edward's personal desire for revenge against the man who had humiliated English military power at Stirling Bridge. The immediate transformation of Wallace from defeated rebel to martyred hero revealed the fundamental miscalculation underlying Edward's execution strategy. Rather than deterring Scottish resistance through demonstration of English power, Wallace's death provided a powerful symbol of Scottish sacrifice for independence that transcended the military defeats and political failures of his actual career. The brutal circumstances of his execution, widely reported throughout Scotland and beyond, generated sympathy for Scottish independence claims while portraying English rule as fundamentally illegitimate and tyrannical. Wallace's posthumous influence on Scottish national consciousness proved far more significant than his actual military and political achievements during his lifetime. His transformation into a symbol of Scottish resistance to foreign domination provided inspiration for subsequent independence leaders, while establishing narrative frameworks that would influence Scottish political thought for centuries. The legendary accounts of his life and death, while often historically inaccurate, created powerful cultural resources for maintaining Scottish national identity during periods of English political control. The execution of William Wallace on August 23, 1305, marked the end of one phase of Scottish independence struggles, while inadvertently providing the symbolic foundations for their eventual success. Edward's belief that eliminating Wallace would end Scottish resistance proved fundamentally mistaken, as the martyred Guardian's example inspired Robert Bruce and others to continue the fight for independence that would ultimately achieve the recognition that had eluded Wallace's diplomatic efforts. In death, Wallace achieved the international recognition and lasting influence that had proven beyond his reach during his remarkable but ultimately tragic career as Scotland's most celebrated Guardian.